The moment you start explaining your boundaries to someone who keeps crossing them, something subtle happens. You think you're being mature, you think you're being calm, reasonable, emotionally intelligent, but what's really happening in that moment is deeper than you realize. You are slowly teaching people how to treat you. And the more you explain without change, the more you reveal how much discomfort you are willing to tolerate just to keep the peace. Most people don't lose respect in one dramatic moment. They lose it in small, quiet negotiations, in the extra explanation, in the nervous laughter, in the second chance that becomes the seventh. And somewhere along the way, you start feeling drained, confused, and slightly resentful, even though you were the one trying to handle it maturely. In this video, we're going to talk about the one internal shift that stops toxic dynamics at the root. Not by becoming louder, not by becoming colder, but by becoming grounded. We'll explore how Stoicism teaches us to reclaim our power, not through confrontation, but through composure, not through revenge, but through self-mastery. If you're someone who values inner strength over outer noise, clarity over chaos, and discipline over drama, then you're in the right place. Consider subscribing, not as a favor to this channel, but as a quiet commitment to your own growth. A reminder that you are choosing steadiness over impulse, reflection over reaction, and self-mastery over emotional turbulence. There is a quiet moment that most people rarely pay attention to, yet it carries enormous influence over the way they experience relationships and conflict. It does not happen during the loud exchange, nor does it unfold in the middle of visible disrespect. It occurs afterward, when everything appears calm on the outside. You are alone, the conversation has ended, the tension in the room has dissolved, but your mind continues to replay what happened. You hear the tone again, you see the expression again. You mentally reconstruct your own words and adjust them as though you are editing a script. You imagine how you could have sounded firmer, wiser, more composed. Beneath that mental rehearsal rests a subtle belief. If I explain myself better next time, they will finally understand, and things will change. That belief feels responsible and emotionally mature because it reflects a desire for clarity rather than conflict. It feels like growth because you are trying to communicate instead of retaliate. However, in certain dynamics, that very belief quietly sustains the cycle you are trying to escape. The person who repeatedly crosses your boundaries is rarely confused about what you mean. They may claim misunderstanding, but patterns reveal awareness. They are observing how you respond, how long it takes before you react, how much emotional energy you invest in defending yourself, and how consistently you reinforce your limits. When explanations are repeated without consequences, the lesson being taught is not clarity but tolerance. This realization can be difficult because it challenges the assumption that better communication alone resolves repeated disrespect. While communication is valuable in healthy relationships, it does not transform someone who benefits from ignoring your limits. When behavior continues unchanged despite repeated explanations, the issue is no longer about wording or tone. It becomes a question of structure and reinforcement. Human behavior adapts to reward. If a pattern yields advantage without cost, it tends to persist. The dynamic shifts not when words improve, but when responses change. Stoic philosophy provides a framework that brings sobering clarity to this issue. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself that he could not control the actions, motives, or character of others. He could only govern his own judgments and conduct. This perspective does not deny that unfairness exists. Rather, it redirects focus toward the only domain that remains within reach. When you accept that someone's character lies outside your control, you stop investing in the fantasy that perfect articulation will reform them. Instead, you begin to concentrate on stabilizing your own posture. Expectation plays a powerful role in sustaining emotional frustration. When you expect fairness from someone who consistently behaves unfairly, you enter interactions with hope rather than evidence. Hope is not inherently misguided, but when it overrides observable patterns, it becomes an emotional liability. You begin to respond not to who the person is, but to who you wish they would become. Seneca observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, and much of that imagined suffering arises from anticipated transformation that never materializes. The disappointment that follows repeated unmet expectations is often more painful than the original disrespect. Clarity begins when you align your perception with consistent behavior rather than isolated moments of charm or apology. A person reveals themselves not through occasional kindness, but through repeated conduct, especially under stress or disagreement. When this recognition settles in, your reactions gradually change. You no longer approach conversations as opportunities to persuade someone into decency. You approach them with steadiness, aware that your role is not to convert, but to conduct yourself with integrity. This shift from reaction to observation alters your emotional experience. Instead of feeling personally targeted in every instance of disrespect, you start noticing patterns. You see repetition where before you saw isolated events. You recognize predictability where before you felt surprise. Epictetus taught that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our interpretations of them. When repeated boundary violations are interpreted as personal failures to communicate effectively, frustration intensifies. When they are understood as patterns reinforced by previous reactions, emotional intensity decreases because the situation becomes understandable rather than chaotic. Understanding reinforcement clarifies why certain dynamics persist. If anger consistently provokes a reaction that provides attention or control, it becomes a useful tactic for the other person. If subtle insults prompt lengthy defenses, those defenses signal emotional investment. Even silence, when paired with visible discomfort, communicates information. None of these responses are morally wrong, they are natural. However, in unhealthy dynamics, they become data points that shape future behavior. Introducing a pause disrupts predictability. When you resist the immediate urge to defend, correct, or retaliate, you interrupt the familiar exchange. The pause does not signal weakness, it signals evaluation. You are choosing whether the comment deserves engagement. This interruption can initially feel unnatural because your nervous system seeks resolution. Immediate reaction provides temporary relief. Yet temporary relief often reinforces the long-term cycle. Psychological research describes a phenomenon known as an extinction burst, in which a behavior that previously produced reward intensifies briefly when the reward disappears. When someone accustomed to eliciting emotional reactions suddenly encounters calm steadiness, escalation may follow. Their tone may sharpen, their accusations may intensify, and their efforts to provoke may increase. This escalation is often misinterpreted as evidence that the new approach is ineffective. In reality, it may indicate that the old reinforcement pattern is weakening. Remaining steady during escalation requires discipline because the impulse to restore equilibrium is strong. Returning to familiar reactions feels comfortable, even if those reactions have not produced lasting change. Marcus Aurelius advised himself not to become like those whose behavior he disapproved of, a reminder that composure is not passive submission, but active self-governance. When you respond to heightened intensity with measured clarity, you refuse to mirror chaos. Over time, consistency reshapes expectations. Nevertheless, composure alone does not eliminate internal discomfort. Certain remarks continue to linger, and their persistence reveals deeper layers. Carl Jung suggested that what irritates or unsettles us often points toward unexamined aspects of ourselves. When an insult resonates long after the conversation ends, it may connect to an existing insecurity rather than the present moment alone. This realization shifts focus inward without excusing external disrespect. Self-acceptance becomes central at this stage. When you privately acknowledge your imperfections and growth areas, criticism loses some of its destabilizing force. Marcus Aurelius expressed willingness to change when shown evidence of error, reflecting strength grounded in honesty rather than pride. Accepting that you are still evolving does not weaken you. It reduces the vulnerability that comes from denial. If there is truth in criticism, you adjust. If there is none, you release it without internalizing it. As self-awareness deepens, the need for external validation gradually decreases. Your worth becomes less dependent on another person's recognition or approval. This internal anchoring shifts your behavior subtly but powerfully. You become selective with your energy and time. Selectivity is not hostility, it is discernment. You offer access in proportion to respect. Conversations become practical rather than emotionally expansive when respect is absent. Vulnerability is extended only where it is handled responsibly. Such adjustments are rarely announced. They are lived. Over time, others sense the change. Reactions that once yielded predictable emotional responses now encounter steadiness. Some individuals withdraw when they no longer receive reinforcement. Others adapt their behavior in response to the altered dynamic. Regardless of their choice, your internal landscape becomes quieter because you are no longer negotiating your dignity through repeated explanations. The central transformation does not occur through confrontation, but through a quiet internal decision. You release the expectation that someone will become different simply because you wish it. You accept patterns as they are, and you adjust accordingly. This acceptance does not make you cynical, it grounds you in reality. When your responses align with reality rather than hope alone, stability increases. As stability increases, emotional noise decreases. You spend less time replaying conversations and more time conserving energy. You no longer experience every instance of disrespect as a personal referendum on your worth. Instead, you recognize it as information about the other person's character and about the level of access they will have moving forward. In this way, the cycle begins to dissolve not because you forced change in someone else, but because you strengthened governance within yourself. The shift is subtle, yet profound. You stop over-explaining your boundaries to someone who has already demonstrated awareness of them. You stop equating patience with endurance of repeated disregard. You stop believing that better articulation guarantees better treatment. And through that internal clarity, your posture changes in a way that quietly transforms the dynamic around you. As this internal clarity begins to settle, something else becomes visible that you may not have noticed before. Much of your previous effort was not simply about defending boundaries, it was about protecting an image. You wanted to be seen as reasonable, fair, kind, and mature. You wanted the other person to recognize that you were not the problem. In many ways, you were trying to preserve your identity in their eyes. That desire is deeply human because we are social beings, and approval feels stabilizing. However, when your sense of stability depends too heavily on how someone else perceives you, their perception gains disproportionate power. This is where another subtle shift unfolds. You begin to see that the need to be understood can quietly become a vulnerability. When someone senses that you want them to see you as good or reasonable, they can use that desire to keep you engaged. They may accuse you of things that force you into defense. They may distort events in ways that compel you to correct the record. Each correction becomes proof that you are emotionally invested in their opinion. The cycle continues because the need for recognition keeps you participating. Carl Jung once observed that the most painful conflicts often arise from our projections and unmet needs. When you look closely, you may realize that part of the distress in repeated disrespect is not just about the behavior itself, but about what it threatens. It threatens your sense of being valued. It threatens your belief that fairness will prevail. It threatens your expectation that maturity will be reciprocated. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning your standards. It means freeing them from dependency on someone else's cooperation. As you detach from the need to win understanding, your communication becomes simpler. You do not over-elaborate. You do not over-justify. You speak plainly, and then you allow silence to exist without rushing to fill it. Silence, when grounded in confidence rather than fear, carries a different weight. It signals that you are not scrambling for approval. It suggests that you are comfortable with your own position, even if it is not validated in the moment. This comfort grows gradually, not instantly. At first, silence may feel awkward. You may feel an urge to soften your statement or add clarification to prevent discomfort. Yet each time you resist that urge, you strengthen a new pattern within yourself. You learn that discomfort does not need to be erased immediately. You learn that steadiness can coexist with tension. Over time, this steadiness becomes natural rather than forced. There is also a practical dimension to this transformation. When repeated disrespect continues despite calm communication, you begin to reduce exposure. You limit the depth of conversation. You restrict topics that previously became weapons. You shorten interactions when they show signs of repeating the same pattern. This is not about punishment or retaliation. It is about protecting your internal equilibrium. Aristotle noted that knowing oneself is the beginning of wisdom, and self-knowledge includes understanding what environments and behaviors erode your composure. By adjusting exposure, you change the terrain on which the dynamic operates. If someone repeatedly exploits emotional discussions to undermine you, you limit emotional discussions. If they thrive on public criticism, you minimize public engagement. These changes are strategic rather than reactive. They are guided by awareness of patterns rather than by momentary anger. Over time, the absence of easy access to your reactions reduces the incentive for disrespect. Still, this process requires patience because old habits do not disappear overnight. You may occasionally slip into over-explaining or defending yourself more than necessary. When that happens, it is important not to respond with self-criticism. Seneca wrote about the importance of gentle self-correction, recognizing that growth is iterative. Instead of condemning yourself for reacting, you observe it, understand why it happened, and refine your response next time. This reflective practice strengthens internal governance. As internal governance strengthens, your sense of self becomes less fragile. You begin to notice that certain remarks no longer disturb you as deeply as before. The same words that once lingered for hours now fade more quickly. This does not mean you are indifferent. It means you are anchored. Your identity is less reactive to external input because it is grounded in your own evaluation rather than in someone else's judgment. Epictetus emphasized that freedom lies in distinguishing what is within your control from what is not. In relational dynamics, you cannot control another person's respect, honesty, or maturity. You can control your response, your boundaries, and your level of access. When you consistently align your behavior with this distinction, emotional turbulence decreases. You expend less energy trying to manage variables that were never yours to govern. There is also an unexpected benefit to this steadiness. When you stop chasing fairness from someone who has shown disregard, you reclaim energy that was previously consumed by rumination. The mental rehearsals become less frequent. The urge to revisit every detail of past conversations weakens. Your attention gradually shifts toward areas of life that nourish rather than drain you. This redirection of attention reinforces your stability because it reduces exposure to triggers. In many cases, people who once pushed boundaries begin to recalibrate their behavior when they realize the old tactics no longer produce results. Some may test again briefly, hoping for a return to familiar reactions. Others may quietly adjust their tone and approach, and some may withdraw entirely, seeking environments where their behavior meets less resistance. Whatever their response, your steadiness remains intact because it no longer depends on their adaptation. This steadiness also influences how you perceive yourself. You start to recognize that dignity is not something granted externally, but maintained internally. When you no longer over-explain your worth, you feel less compelled to prove it. When you no longer react impulsively to every provocation, you see evidence of your own growth. This self-recognition strengthens confidence in a way that external validation never could. Carl Jung suggested that true individuation requires integrating all aspects of oneself, including vulnerabilities. As you integrate your insecurities rather than denying them, they lose their capacity to be exploited. You accept that you are imperfect and evolving, which makes you less defensive when confronted. Paradoxically, accepting imperfection increases resilience because it removes the fear of exposure. Over time, the central theme becomes clearer. The transformation was never about changing the other person. It was about stabilizing your internal foundation so completely that their behavior lost its leverage. You no longer negotiate dignity through repeated explanation. You embody it through consistent action. You no longer rely on emotional intensity to assert boundaries. You rely on alignment between words and consequences. In practical terms, this alignment may look simple. If a boundary is crossed, you restate it once calmly. If it is crossed again, you adjust behavior rather than repeating the speech. If a topic becomes a recurring source of disrespect, you disengage from it without drama. Each adjustment reinforces the message that your boundaries are not hypothetical. They are structural. This structural approach changes the emotional landscape of your interactions. Instead of approaching each exchange with apprehension, you approach it with grounded awareness. You know what you will and will not tolerate. You know how you will respond if patterns repeat. This predictability within yourself reduces anxiety because you are not improvising under pressure. You have already decided who you are in those moments. The final layer of this process involves acceptance of outcomes. Even after you adjust your posture and reduce exposure, some relationships may not improve. In some cases, distance increases. In others, the connection fades. Accepting this possibility is part of the transformation. It reflects a willingness to prioritize internal stability over maintaining a dynamic that consistently undermines it. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself that external events do not define the quality of his character. What defines it is how he responds. In the context of repeated disrespect, this means that even if the other person remains unchanged, your integrity remains intact. You are not required to sacrifice self-respect to preserve proximity. As you continue practicing this steadiness, the changes compound. You notice that you are less reactive in other areas of life as well. Traffic irritates you less. Minor criticism does not derail your day. Emotional storms pass more quickly because you are accustomed to observing rather than immediately engaging. The discipline developed in one dynamic strengthens resilience across many others. Eventually, the quiet decision that began this transformation becomes second nature. You no longer hope that someone will wake up and become different. You accept who they are and adjust accordingly. You no longer interpret every instance of disrespect as a challenge to your worth. You see it as information about their character and about the boundaries you must maintain. This is how the cycle dissolves, not through confrontation or domination, but through alignment, not through louder arguments, but through quieter conviction. The day you stop over-explaining your worth and start living from it consistently is the day the emotional turbulence begins to subside. The world around you may not become gentler overnight, but your internal landscape becomes steadier, and that steadiness changes everything. As steadiness becomes more natural, you begin to notice something that once felt impossible. Situations that used to drain you now pass with less impact. The same comments that once replayed in your mind for hours now fade more quickly. It is not that you suddenly developed indifference. It is that your sense of self is no longer swinging with every external opinion. There is a center forming within you, and that center does not move easily. This center is built slowly. It grows every time you choose not to over-explain. It strengthens every time you allow silence instead of scrambling for approval. It stabilizes every time you respond to facts instead of reacting to labels. And what once felt like an act begins to feel like alignment. Dismisses you, interrupts you, or dismisses you, interrupts you, or belittles you. They are not only expressing irritation, they are, consciously or unconsciously, testing influence. They are observing whether their tone dictates your emotional state. If it does, they gain subtle leverage. Once you stop giving that leverage, the dynamic changes in ways that are not always dramatic, but are deeply significant. The conversation may become shorter, the emotional intensity may drop, or sometimes the person may become quieter because the usual reward has disappeared. The key point is not their reaction. It is your internal response. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. In the context of repeated disrespect, your why becomes your commitment to self-respect. When that commitment is clear, you are less tempted to trade it for temporary peace. You understand that short-term harmony achieved through self-abandonment eventually becomes long-term resentment. This awareness also protects you from a different trap, overcorrecting into coldness. There is a fine distinction between detachment and emotional shutdown. Detachment is clarity without hostility. Shutdown is withdrawal rooted in bitterness. One preserves energy, the other builds walls. The difference lies in intention. When you detach with clarity, you are not punishing the other person. You are preserving yourself. You remain capable of warmth where respect exists. You remain capable of openness where reciprocity is present. You simply refuse to extend depth into spaces that consistently distort it. That balance prevents you from becoming hardened while still protecting your inner ground. As you practice this balance, you may encounter moments of loneliness. When you stop engaging in familiar conflict patterns, the silence can feel unfamiliar. You may miss the intensity, even if it was draining. Emotional turbulence can become a strange kind of habit. Its absence can feel like emptiness at first. This is where self-reflection becomes important. You begin to ask yourself what you truly value in connection. Is it constant validation? Is it dramatic reconciliation after conflict? Or is it quiet respect that does not require endless negotiation? As your values clarify, your tolerance for unhealthy dynamics decreases naturally. Carl Jung spoke about individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others expect you to be. In many repeated conflicts, part of the tension arises from trying to meet expectations that do not align with your authentic boundaries. When you release the need to satisfy unrealistic demands, you step closer to authenticity. That authenticity may unsettle those who benefited from your previous flexibility, but it strengthens you. Over time, the internal rehearsal of conversations diminishes. You no longer spend hours perfecting imaginary speeches. Instead, you trust your steady posture. If something needs to be said, you say it once. If it is ignored, you adjust behavior rather than repeating it. This behavioral adjustment communicates more than any extended explanation could. There is also an unexpected confidence that emerges. It is not loud. It is not performative. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows their limits and enforces them consistently. Others sense this consistency. They recognize that you do not shift dramatically based on mood. You do not threaten and then retract. You do not declare boundaries you are unwilling to maintain. This reliability reshapes how people approach you. Immanuel Kant emphasized the importance of acting according to principles rather than impulses. When your boundaries become principles rather than emotional reactions, they carry more weight. They are not reactions to a bad day. They are expressions of a stable value system. Acting from principle rather than impulse reduces regret because your actions align with your long-term standards. As this alignment deepens, something else becomes apparent. You no longer feel compelled to correct every misunderstanding. You realize that not all misinterpretations require defense. Sometimes, letting someone hold an inaccurate opinion about you preserves more energy than attempting to change it. That realization marks a significant shift in maturity. The desire to be universally understood often masks a fear of being misjudged. Yet being misjudged does not diminish your integrity. When your self-evaluation is grounded in honest reflection, external misjudgment loses its destabilizing force. You still prefer fairness, but you are no longer dependent on it. There may also be moments when you choose to disengage entirely from certain dynamics. This decision is rarely dramatic. It unfolds quietly. You respond less frequently. You decline invitations to engage in known cycles. You redirect conversations when they approach familiar traps. Over time, the relationship either recalibrates or fades. Accepting that some connections cannot be repaired through effort alone is part of the growth process. You cannot carry the entire weight of mutual respect. If the other person is unwilling to participate in a healthier pattern, distance becomes a rational outcome rather than a failure. Stoic thought reinforces this acceptance. You focus on what lies within your control, your words, your reactions, your access. You release what does not, their motives, their interpretations, their maturity. This division of control reduces internal conflict because you are no longer fighting variables beyond your reach. As this mindset becomes habitual, your overall resilience increases. Minor irritations lose their edge. Disagreements feel less threatening. You are less reactive because you are less invested in external validation. Your energy becomes available for pursuits that align with your values rather than for endless conflict management. The central theme continues to echo quietly. You stop explaining your worth repeatedly and begin embodying it consistently. Embodiment requires less speech and more action. It requires fewer emotional displays and more steady enforcement. It requires less hope for transformation and more acceptance of reality. Over months and years, this approach shapes your character. You become someone who does not panic under pressure, someone who does not scramble for approval, someone who does not collapse under criticism. That transformation is gradual, but it is powerful. You may look back at earlier versions of yourself and notice how much energy was spent trying to persuade others to treat you well. That energy, once reclaimed, fuels self-development, meaningful relationships, and personal growth. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. In the end, the quiet decision to stop negotiating dignity reshapes your emotional world. Disrespect may still appear from time to time because human imperfection persists. However, it no longer dictates your internal state. It no longer triggers the same cascade of self-doubt and defensive explanation. Instead, it becomes information. Information about character, information about compatibility, information about where to invest and where to withdraw. And through that information, your life becomes calmer, not empty, not detached from connection, calmer because your reactions are no longer governed by the unpredictable behavior of others. They are guided by the steady principles you have chosen to live by. That steadiness is not dramatic, but it is transformative. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It simply stands firm. And when you stand that way consistently, the dynamics around you adjust. Not because you forced them to, but because you changed the only part that was ever truly yours to govern. There comes a point in your life when you realize that peace is not found in winning arguments, proving your worth, or finally being understood by everyone. Peace is found in standing firm without raising your voice, in choosing not to react when reaction is expected, in knowing who you are so clearly that no one else's opinion can shake your foundation. That is real power, quiet power, stoic power. The moment you stop negotiating your dignity is the moment your life becomes lighter, not because the world suddenly becomes kinder, but because you finally become unshakable. If this resonated with you, there's another video on the screen right now that goes even deeper into building that kind of inner strength. Watch that next, and keep strengthening the part of you that refuses to live as a reaction. Thank you for being part of Psychresto Mind. Keep sharpening your mind, keep guarding your peace, and I'll see you in the next one.